Before governments retreat underground, they often change something far more ordinary: the room. After the Reichstag fire in 1933, Germany's legislature was moved to the Kroll Opera House, a temporary, seemingly practical decision. But the space altered the performance of power. Representatives no longer sat in a chamber designed for deliberation. They watched from balconies while authority was staged below. The shift did not announce itself as a transformation of the system. It presented itself as necessity. Yet it marked an early moment when venue began to reshape governance itself, when politics became something less mediated, more theatrical, and more centered on a single figure. This is not a story of sudden collapse into extremity. It is about how, step by step, the spaces of governance can be redesigned in response to perceived threat, until the character of governance itself begins to change. On a spring evening in Washington, the 2026 White House Correspondents' Dinner was meant to be what it has always been: a ritual of proximity, a moment when the distance between power and the public narrows just enough to be staged. Then it became something else. A security incident, one more in a series, reframed the event, not as theatre, but as exposure. Within days, a proposal that had been described as a ballroom for state dinners was being defended as a way to keep the president from leaving the White House at all. That is why the White House ballroom matters. Not because Washington is Berlin, and not because a ballroom is secretly a Führerbunker. It matters because it makes concrete a larger pattern that has been unfolding in public language for months. The project was announced in July 2025 as a 90,000 square foot ballroom and East Wing modernization for state functions, designed to match the White House and improve its ceremonial capacity. Since then, the same project has become legally contested after demolition of the East Wing and politically redefined through the language of security. Trump initially declared that private money would fund the ballroom itself, later adding a plan for public funds to cover an underground bunker and other security improvements. Legislation was then proposed to authorize or fund the $400 million project, including military infrastructure and a Secret Service annex beneath the ballroom. It is tempting to begin there, with the most vivid image: the ballroom, the bunker beneath it, the suggestion of a government retreating behind reinforced walls. But political systems rarely move in a single dramatic step. They move by stages, and the early stages often present themselves as perfectly reasonable. A bureaucracy is said to be unaccountable. A border is said to be broken. A foreign adversary is said to be nearing a point of no return. A leader's exposure is said to be intolerably dangerous. Each claim differs in object, but the grammar is the same. Danger is expanding, ordinary institutions are inadequate, and stronger measures are therefore required. By the time architecture begins to harden, the deeper transformation has already taken place. The broader pattern comes into view in 4 stages. First, the government itself becomes suspect. Trump did not introduce DOGE as a modest reform effort. In his November 2024 statement announcing it, he said Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy would help dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies. Reuters later reported that the civilian federal workforce shrank by 12% between September 2024 and January 2026, a reduction of roughly 386,826 positions, while the Department of Homeland Security was one of the few places that grew slightly because immigration enforcement hiring was increasing. The premise here is not that institutions are flawed and need correction. It is that they are captured, bloated, or disloyal and must be broken open, bypassed, or brought to heel. Governance stops looking procedural and starts looking adversarial. In the early years of Nazi rule, the German state was not presented as something to be managed or improved. It was described as something that had been corrupted from within and needed to be purged. The process was formalized through measures like the 1933 law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which removed officials deemed politically unreliable, including Jews and political opponents, from government positions. What had been a bureaucratic system became a political one, where loyalty to the leader replaced procedural neutrality as the standard for participation. The point is not ideological equivalence, it is structural sequence. Before a system turns outward in search of enemies, it often turns inward. It identifies internal elements as subversive, disloyal, or obstructive, and reorganizes the state around the idea that those elements must be removed or controlled. What had been a mediating structure becomes an object of suspicion. And once that shift occurs, centralization no longer appears as an expansion of power. It appears as a necessary act of defense. The second stage is demographic and territorial. Suspicion of the state widens into suspicion of the population inside its borders. Immigration ceases to be described as a hard policy problem and becomes an invasion, a standing emergency, a sign that the nation itself is being breached. That language is now formalized in administration documents. One January 20th, 2025 presidential action is titled "Protecting the American People Against Invasion," and another, "Guaranteeing the State's Protection Against Invasion." Publicly, the administration has often invoked the worst of the worst, but Reuters reported in 2025 that heightened ICE arrest targets complicated that claim, pushing enforcement beyond serious criminal cases to sweeping up aliens with no criminal history whatsoever. When a government begins to talk this way, courts, hearings, asylum procedures, and local restraints cease to look like mediating institutions and start to look like loopholes. The issue is no longer only who broke the law, it is who belongs inside the perimeter. The historical parallel here is legal and categorical. In the early years of Nazi rule, the regime moved quickly from targeting political opponents to redefining entire groups within the population as suspect by virtue of who they were. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 formalized this shift, transforming Jewish citizens from individuals with legal standing into a category defined as outside the national community. The question was no longer what someone had done, but what they were, and whether they belonged. Legal process did not disappear, but it changed function. It became a mechanism for classification and exclusion, rather than adjudication. Once a government begins to treat segments of the population as inherently suspect, ordinary legal distinctions start to erode. Individual cases matter less than group identity. Procedure begins to look like obstruction. And the boundary between enforcement and exclusion begins to blur. What had been a system for determining violations becomes a system for determining belonging. The third stage is external and anticipatory. Danger is no longer simply present. It is projected forward, latent, concealed, always nearing some decisive threshold. The administration's posture toward Iran over the past 2 months reflects this shift. The conflict did not begin with a clearly articulated end state. Instead, its justification has moved from one rationale to another. First, the need to respond, then the need to deter, then the need to degrade capabilities, then the need to confront the nuclear question before it could reach some undefined point of no return. Each step has been framed not as escalation, but as necessity, an action taken because waiting would be more dangerous than acting. This is the logic of preemption, but in a more fluid form. The threat is not fixed, it evolves as policy evolves. What matters is not only what an adversary has done, but what it might be building, concealing, or approaching. That makes ordinary diplomacy appear insufficient, because diplomacy operates on sequence and verification, while the perceived danger is imagined as accelerating beyond both. In that environment, each unresolved issue becomes grounds for further action. The horizon of risk keeps moving forward, and policy follows it. The result is not a single crisis, but a continuous condition, one in which the absence of resolution is itself treated as evidence that the threat remains active and demands response. The historical parallel here lies in the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. Germany justified the move not as an act of expansion, but as a defensive necessity in response to a changing and uncertain strategic environment, particularly the Franco-Soviet Pact, which was presented as a looming threat. The argument was not that Germany was under attack, but that it might soon be constrained, encircled, or placed at a permanent disadvantage if it did not act first. The risk was framed as anticipatory, and therefore action could not wait for confirmation. What followed was not a single decisive break, but a test of thresholds. The move into the Rhineland was, in military terms, cautious. German forces were under orders to withdraw if challenged. But once no response came, the perceived boundary shifted. The absence of resistance became evidence that the risk had been justified and that further action might be possible. The horizon moved forward. Each step did not resolve the underlying anxiety. It relocated it, producing new reasons to act again. The point is not equivalence of circumstance. It is a shared structure of reasoning. When policy is driven by anticipated danger rather than immediate threat, restraint begins to look like exposure. Action becomes easier to justify than delay. And because the feared outcome is always just ahead, the condition never fully resolves. It persists as a continuous rationale for further movement. The fourth stage is the most personal, and therefore the most volatile. By this point, the earlier threat narratives of hostile bureaucracy, internal invasion, and looming foreign danger have accumulated enough force that they can be read back into the leader's own vulnerability. Assassination attempts and security incidents do not create the pattern, but they sharpen it and give it emotional force. Public appearances become risk surfaces. Crowds become uncertainties. Movement beyond the perimeter becomes something closer to exposure than to politics. Reuters reported that congressional Republicans were now pushing legislation to fund and expedite the ballroom on the grounds that it would provide a secure venue for presidential events. AP reported that, after the shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the administration pressed preservationists to drop their lawsuit, arguing that the project would reduce public outings and therefore enhance security. This is the stage at which governance and protection begin to fuse. Before there was the bunker, there was the chancellery, an expanding leader-centered administrative and ceremonial world. Hitler decided in 1933 that the existing Reich Chancellery was too small. Plans for a large reception hall followed. The Vorbunker was completed beneath that expanded complex in 1936. Speer's new Reich Chancellery, built in 1938 and 1939, added Hitler's office and apartment, a court of honor, a marble gallery, and grand halls for ceremony and reception. The point is not ideological sameness, it is structural sequence. Before a system descends, it often concentrates. It gathers access, administration, spectacle, and symbolic authority around a single person. In that system, access itself was political. Who entered, who waited, who approached the leader, who moved through which corridor. All of it was structured to dramatize hierarchy and regulate proximity. The common mechanism is not the ideology of 1930s Germany. It is the politics of controlled access. Once internal populations are framed as systemic threats, open civic space begins to feel less like democratic normality and more like exposure. The state starts asking not just what it should do, but who should be allowed near it. Historically, the Vorbunker mattered because it was not yet the Führerbunker. It was a shelter added beneath an already concentrated ceremonial complex, with the reception hall literally resting above it. The visible and hidden structures were made to support one another. That is what makes the White House project symbolically charged. The issue is no longer only whether a president wants a grand room for state dinners. It is whether ceremonial architecture is being reconceived as the shell for a hardened substrate. Reuters reported in March that Trump described the ballroom as a shed for a massive military complex under it, emphasized bulletproof glass and a drone-proof roof, and said, "Unfortunately, we're living in an age where that is a good thing." That word, shed, is the tell. It reverses the hierarchy. The ballroom ceases to be the main thing. It becomes the envelope for what matters underneath. At that point, the pattern becomes self-sealing. Negative reactions to one set of policies are folded into the threat narrative that justifies the next set. Resistance becomes sabotage. Litigation becomes danger. Public exposure becomes something a prudent government should minimize. The administration is then able to present each new hardening measure not as a choice, but as a necessity. No choice but to purge. No choice but to deport. No choice but to strike first. No choice but to bring the spectacle of state inside the perimeter and build more beneath it. The danger is not only that such measures are taken, it is that the measures themselves become evidence, after the fact, that the underlying threat must have been immense all along. This is why the Chancellery analogy is so useful. The new Reich Chancellery was already a self-contained world before the final underground refuge became dominant. Office, apartment, ceremony, reception, spectacle, intimidation, filtered access. Hitler moved into the deeper Führerbunker only on January 16, 1945. For a time, he still used the Chancellery above ground. Only later, under conditions of real military collapse, did the underground environment become the regime's center of gravity. The bunker did not invent the logic of concentration. It radicalized a system that had already gathered power, security, and symbolic life around the person of the leader. The American case is not the German one. The differences remain decisive. The United States is not under military siege. Courts are active. Congress is fighting over authorization and funding. Preservation groups are litigating. The press is still reporting the details. Those are not minor distinctions. They are the difference between a process being contested and a process becoming total. But because the endpoint is not here, the stages matter more, not less. They arrive in respectable dress. They call themselves modernization, deterrence, continuity, border security, prudent hardening. Yet, taken together, they can produce a recognizable political architecture, distrust of intermediaries, suspicion of internal populations, an atmosphere of permanent external danger, and finally a leader whose security becomes the organizing principle of public space. The warning is that the logic of the bunker can appear long before the bunker itself becomes central. It appears when government is imagined as survival against hidden enemies. It appears when institutions are trusted only after they have been subordinated. It appears when openness is redescribed as exposure and exposure as danger. And it appears finally when architecture answers a question politics has already been asking for some time. How can power continue to operate without having to trust the world beyond the perimeter? That is where the danger lies. A government that begins to prefer controlled space over open exposure does not only change how it protects itself, it changes how it learns. Information narrows. Feedback becomes filtered. The unscripted encounter, the press conference that goes off track, the public event that introduces an inconvenient voice, the bureaucratic process that slows a decision long enough to surface a flaw, comes to look less like friction than like risk. Over time, the system adapts by minimizing those encounters. History offers a consistent pattern here, and it does not begin underground. In the later years of the Third Reich, long before the final weeks in the Führerbunker, access to Hitler had already become tightly controlled. Information was mediated by a shrinking circle of intermediaries. Reports were filtered, bad news softened or delayed, dissenting assessments excluded. By the time he moved permanently into the bunker in January 1945, the physical enclosure did not create that informational narrowing. It completed it. The structure merely formalized a system that had already reduced its exposure to correction. That has predictable effects. Decisions arrive faster, but often with less revision. Policies become more internally coherent, and at the same time, externally brittle. Opposition is encountered later, and therefore more explosively. When a leadership hears dissent primarily through controlled channels, it tends to interpret disagreement not as input, but as resistance. the earlier stages of the pattern begin to reinforce themselves. If dissent is resistance, resistance is threat. And if threat is everywhere, control must increase. The physical environment reinforces the same tendency. A government that operates increasingly within hardened, leader-centered space is also operating within a thinner social field. The range of people who can directly influence decisions shrinks. Proximity becomes power. Access becomes a kind of political currency. That dynamic was visible in the Chancellery before the bunker became dominant. Influence flowed through corridors, waiting rooms, and personal audiences, not through institutional process. It does not require authoritarian intent to produce this effect. It just emerges naturally when risk is managed through enclosure. Historically, such narrowing has often preceded miscalculation, not necessarily because leaders become irrational, but because they become overconfident in incomplete information. In the final phase of the war, Hitler continued to issue military directives based on assumptions that no longer matched conditions on the ground, divisions that no longer existed, counterattacks that could not be mounted. Those errors were not simply the product of ideology. They were the product of a system that no longer reliably transmitted reality upward. The world outside the perimeter did not disappear. It just became less legible until it asserted itself in ways that were impossible to manage. There is also a more subtle consequence. When public visibility is treated as danger, legitimacy itself begins to shift. Instead of being reinforced through presence, through being seen, challenged, and answered, it is reinforced through protection. The ability to continue operating under threat becomes a kind of proof of authority. That can feel stabilizing in the short term. In the long term, it risks disconnecting power from the public it is meant to represent. None of this produces a single, inevitable outcome. Systems like this can reverse course if countervailing institutions remain strong enough to reopen channels of feedback and exposure. Courts, legislatures, a free press, and a public that insists on access all exert pressure in the opposite direction. The question is not whether hardening occurs, but whether it becomes the default answer to every problem. So the issue is not whether a bunker exists, or even how large it is. The issue is what kind of governing system takes shape around it. A state that repeatedly answers uncertainty by narrowing its field of contact will tend, over time, to make decisions in a thinner informational environment, with fewer corrective inputs and greater reliance on its own internal logic. That is where the risk lies, not in the concrete itself, but in the gradual separation between those who govern and their responsibility to people, country, and the world.